the city bus lurched violently as it rolled over a pothole, jolting Jessica back into the present. Instinctively, she tightened her grip around the small bag resting on her knees as though it contained something fragile, something irreplaceable. In truth, it held almost nothing, just a change of clothes, a toothbrush, a book she doubted she would open, and a few apples carefully packed after the nurse had told her fruit was allowed. The bag looked absurdly small for a journey that felt so immense. She found herself staring out the window, watching the familiar streets of Arbor Hill drift by in muted shades of gray. Late November had stripped the trees bare, their branches skeletal against the cold sky, while thin layers of ice clung stubbornly to puddles that would soon be crushed under the weight of passing tires. The town had not changed. It was exactly as she had always known it, quiet, predictable, almost comforting. And yet, as the bus carried her closer to the clinic, everything felt different, as though she were seeing it all for the very last time. She had lived here her entire life. She knew every street, every corner, every worn crack in the pavement. She had grown up among these houses, walked these sidewalks as a child, and later as an adult, as a teacher, guiding her own students through the same familiar paths. For 10 years, she had taught second grade at the local elementary school, shaping small minds, celebrating small victories, and finding purpose in the quiet rhythm of everyday life. It had always been enough, or at least, she had told herself it was. But now, as the bus moved steadily forward, a strange, unsettling thought crept into her mind. What if this was goodbye? Not a dramatic farewell, not something spoken aloud or acknowledged openly, but something quieter, more fragile. A silent understanding that life as she knew it might end without warning. The surgeon had not lied to her. He had not offered comforting words wrapped in false certainty. Instead, he had spoken with a calm honesty that she had respected, even if she had secretly wished for something else. The tumor is benign, he had said, looking directly into her eyes, but an operation is still an operation. There are always risks. He had explained them clearly: anesthesia complications, the unpredictable nature of the human body. He had not frightened her deliberately. But neither had he softened the truth. And now, sitting on that bus, those words echoed in her mind with a weight she could no longer ignore. For the first time, the reality of it all sank in, not just intellectually, but somewhere deeper, somewhere she could not reason with or control. Strangely, her thoughts did not turn immediately to her husband. Evan had been a part of her life for 8 years, a presence so constant that it had become almost invisible, like background noise she had stopped noticing. Instead, her mind drifted to her classroom, to Ben, who had finally learned to read without stumbling over every second word, to Paige with her sharp tongue and perpetually untied shoelaces, to little Danny, who had cried on the first day of school and now raced into the classroom every morning with bright, eager eyes. She wondered who would stand at the door to greet them if she wasn't there. Who would explain verb tenses, who would patiently wait for Danny when he needed an extra moment, who would notice the small things that mattered so much in a child's world. The realization struck her quietly, without drama. She was thinking about her students, not her husband, and that said more about her marriage than any argument ever could. There had never been shouting, never any visible cracks that outsiders could point to and label as failure. It had been something subtler, something harder to define. A slow fading of importance, a gradual shift in which her voice, her needs, her presence had become secondary. Evan had always occupied the center of the room, literally and figuratively, while she adjusted herself around him without even realizing it. Over time, she had stopped asking for more, stopped expecting anything at all. It had seemed easier that way. And now, on the morning of what could be the most critical moment of her life, she was traveling alone. No hand to hold, no reassuring voice beside her. Just a small bag, a quiet bus, and the steady hum of thoughts she could not silence. The irony was not lost on her. For years she had lived beside someone and felt alone without fully acknowledging it. And now, facing the possibility of death, that loneliness had finally taken shape, clear and undeniable. The bus slowed as it approached her stop. Jessica inhaled deeply, her breath catching slightly in her chest. The air felt colder, somehow sharper, as if the world itself had shifted. She pressed her fingers lightly against the bag on her. Everything about this moment was real, the fear, the uncertainty, the fragile thread of hope she clung to despite everything. As the doors opened with a soft mechanical hiss, she hesitated for just a fraction of a second. It wasn't fear that held her back exactly, but something more complex, a quiet awareness that stepping off this bus meant crossing an invisible threshold. There would be no turning back, no pretending that this was just another ordinary day. Whatever awaited her beyond those doors would change something, whether she was ready for it or not. And yet she stood up. Because despite the fear, despite the loneliness, despite the overwhelming uncertainty, there was still something within her that moved forward. Not bravely, not heroically, but simply because it had to. Jessica had not always understood that something was wrong with her marriage. In the beginning there had been light, bright, almost blinding. Evan had been the kind of man people noticed the moment he entered a room. He laughed loudly, spoke confidently, and carried himself with a certainty that felt to a younger version of Jessica like strength. When he looked at her, really looked, it felt as though she had been chosen, singled out from the ordinary flow of life. At 24, she had believed that was what love looked like: decisive, undeniable, full of presence. Her mother had warned her gently but firmly that loud men were not always strong men, that sometimes noise was just a way of filling empty space. Jessica had dismissed it at the time, convinced that her mother simply didn't understand what it meant to be swept up in something that felt so alive. For a while, it had worked. The first year and a half of their marriage had been easy in the way that early happiness often is. They laughed, they went out, they made plans that stretched comfortably into the future. There were no obvious cracks, nothing that would make her question the life she had chosen. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, something began to shift. It didn't happen all at once, and that was precisely why she didn't notice it. There was no single moment she could point to and say, "This is where it changed." Instead, it was a series of small adjustments, each one so minor on its own that it felt unreasonable to resist. It started with space. Evan's armchair, large and heavy, seemed to migrate to the center of the living room, becoming the unspoken focal point of the apartment. Jessica's things, by contrast, found their way to the edges, her books stacked neatly on the lowest shelf, her jacket hung on the hook closest to the wall, her presence subtly reorganized around his. It wasn't something they discussed. It simply became the arrangement, the quiet logic of their shared space. At first, she didn't mind. It seemed natural, even polite, to give way a little to accommodate. That was what compromise looked like, she told herself. But compromise, when it flows in only one direction, begins to take on a different shape. Their conversations changed too, though not dramatically. Evan still spoke, still filled the room with his voice, but Jessica noticed that she spoke less, not because she had nothing to say, but because it seemed unnecessary to say it. Her plans for the weekend would be mentioned casually, then gently set aside in favor of his. His work, his schedule, his priorities carried an invisible weight that hers did not. When she brought up something that mattered to her, he would nod. Sometimes even smile, but the conversation would drift inevitably back to him. There were no arguments about it, no raised voices, just a quiet, consistent redirection that over time taught her that her thoughts were secondary. They never fought, and for a long time Jessica considered that a sign of success. Friends complained about shouting matches, about slammed doors and harsh words, and she would listen, grateful that her own marriage was free of such chaos. But what she didn't realize then was that the absence of conflict was not the same as the presence of connection. They didn't fight because she had slowly stopped bringing up the things that might lead to disagreement. It was easier not to. Easier to let things pass, to tell herself it wasn't worth the tension, that peace, even a quiet, hollow kind of peace, was better than confrontation. Children became another quiet absence in their life. In the early years, they had talked about it in vague, hopeful terms. Someday. When the time is right. Evan always had a reason to wait. Not enough money, too much work, you're still young. At first, Jessica agreed. The reasons sounded practical, responsible even. But as the years passed, the reasons changed while the outcome remained the same. There was always something just out of alignment. Something that needed to be fixed before they could move forward. Eventually, she stopped believing in the reasons, but she didn't stop waiting. Waiting became its own kind of habit, something she carried quietly in the background of her life, like a low, persistent hum. The distance between them was not marked by dramatic events, but by accumulation. Evan began coming home later, offering simple explanations that Jessica accepted without question. Were meetings. Clients. She didn't press for details. Not because she trusted him completely, though there was some of that, but because she had forgotten how to insist on answers. It had happened gradually, without a clear beginning. One day she chose not to ask because she was tired. Another day because she didn't want to create unnecessary tension, and then without realizing it, she had stopped asking altogether. There is a particular kind of loneliness that exists within a relationship and it is far more difficult to recognize than the loneliness of being alone. Jessica lived beside Evan, shared a home with him, shared routines and responsibilities, and yet she felt herself receding, becoming less visible even to herself. She adapted to the shape of his life, fitting herself into the spaces that remained, until those spaces became so small that she barely noticed them anymore. When she tried to think back to when she had last felt truly seen by him, she found it difficult to pinpoint a moment. There were gestures, of course, occasional compliments, practical conversations, the surface-level exchanges that sustain a household, but there was no depth to them, no sense that he was genuinely interested in her inner world. He did not ask about her students, did not know their names, did not seem to understand that the classroom was not just a job for her, but a place where she felt most like herself. Over time, she stopped offering those details. It seemed pointless to share something that would not be received. And yet, from the outside, everything appeared stable. They had no scandals, no visible fractures. They functioned as a couple in the way that society recognizes shared finances, shared address, shared history. It was only in the quiet moments, in the spaces between words, that the truth revealed itself. Not in what was said, but in what was missing. Jessica did not think of her marriage as unhappy, not at first. Unhappiness implied something active, something sharp and undeniable. What she experienced was softer, more elusive. It was a gradual dimming, a slow erosion of connection that left behind something that looked intact but felt empty. And because it happened so quietly, so reasonably, she never gave herself permission to question it fully. It was only later, when faced with something far more immediate and undeniable, that she began to understand what had been happening all along. That love, when it is real, does not require you to disappear in order to maintain it, and that silence, when it replaces communication, is not peace, it is absence. The message arrived in the quietest moment of the morning, when the world had not yet fully woken, and the hospital room still carried the heavy stillness of the night. Jessica had barely slept. Her body lay still, but her mind had wandered restlessly between fear and exhaustion, drifting in and out of shallow, fragile dreams. When her phone vibrated softly on the bedside table, the sound felt louder than it should have, cutting through the silence with an almost unnatural clarity. She reached for it automatically, her first thought simple and almost hopeful it might be her mother. But the name on the screen stopped her before she could fully wake into that expectation. Evan. For a brief second, something flickered inside her. Not relief, not quite, but a faint instinctive reaction to the person who had been closest to her for 8 years. Perhaps he was checking on her. Perhaps at the last moment something in him had shifted. She opened the message without hesitation, her eyes scanning the words quickly at first, then slowing as their meaning settled in. "We're getting a divorce. I don't need you, especially not when you're sick. I'm not paying for your surgery. You have insurance. My lawyer will contact you. Don't call." There was no greeting, no hesitation, no softness. Just a series of sentences, clean and final, as if they had been drafted for efficiency rather than humanity. Jessica read it once, then again, as though repetition might change. Something might reveal a different layer beneath the surface. But the words remained exactly the same, flat, cold, unmistakable. For a moment she didn't react. Her mind seemed to pause, unable to process what her eyes had already understood. 8 years. The thought came not as a sentence but as a weight. 8 years of shared mornings, shared meals, shared silence. 8 years of adjusting, of waiting, of telling herself that things would eventually fall into place. And now all of it reduced to a message sent in the early hours of the morning, delivered without voice, without presence, without even the basic acknowledgement of what she was about to face. The shock did not arrive as a sudden explosion of emotion. It came slowly, almost gently, like a crack forming beneath the surface of something that had already been fragile for a long time. She became aware of her breathing first, too shallow, uneven. Then of the way her hands tightened around the phone as if holding onto it could somehow anchor her in a moment that was beginning to slip away from reason. She tried to think, to find some explanation that made sense. Something that could fit into the version of reality she had been living in until now. But there was nothing. No misunderstanding. No hidden meaning, just the clear, undeniable fact that he had chosen this moment, this exact moment on the eve of her surgery to leave. And then the tears came. Not loudly, not dramatically. They slipped out quietly at first, almost unnoticed, blurring the screen as she stared at it. She didn't realize she was crying until her vision shifted, until the words dissolved into shapes she could no longer read. Her shoulders began to tremble, small, involuntary movements that she couldn't control. She pressed the phone against her chest as though trying to contain something that had already broken free, something that had been held back for far too long. It wasn't just the message, it was everything behind it. Every moment she had dismissed, every silence she had accepted, every time she had chosen not to ask questions because it seemed easier that way, all of it rose at once, overwhelming in its clarity. The realization was brutal in its simplicity. He had already left long before he sent that message. This was not a sudden decision. It was the final step in something that had been unfolding quietly, steadily. While she convinced herself that patience was enough to hold a marriage together, she bent forward, her body folding in on itself, not from physical pain but from something deeper, something harder to name. There is a particular kind of grief that comes not from losing something new but from finally understanding what has already been lost. Jessica felt it now in full force. Not just the loss of Evan, but the loss of the years she had given to a relationship that had never truly held her the way she had believed it did. And yet beneath the shock, beneath the pain, something else began to emerge. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there, a shift, a moment of clarity that cut through the chaos of her emotions. He had left, completely undeniably. There was no ambiguity left to hold on to, no illusion to preserve. The waiting was over, not because things had improved, but because there was nothing left to wait for. In that moment, as the reality settled around her, Jessica realized that something fundamental had changed. Not in him, he had already made his decision, but in her. The message, as cruel as it was, had stripped away the last layer of uncertainty. It forced her to see her life as it truly was, not as she had hoped it might become. And with that clarity, painful as it was, came the beginning of something new. The hospital room was quieter than Jessica had expected, almost unnaturally, so as if the walls themselves absorbed sound to protect the fragile stillness inside. It was a double room, 2 beds, 2 narrow nightstands, a single window overlooking a small courtyard where a leafless bush stood against the pale November sky. The air carried the faint scent of disinfectant, mixed with something older, something that lingered beneath the surface like time itself had settled into the corners. When she stepped inside, her presence felt like an intrusion, a disruption to a space that had already established its own quiet rhythm. One of the beds, the one closer to the door, was empty, neatly made with crisp white sheets that seemed almost too perfect, as though no one had ever truly rested there. The other bed near the window was occupied. A man sat propped up against the pillows, holding a book, not a phone, not a tablet, but a real book with worn edges and a spine that had clearly been opened many times before. He looked up as she entered, not abruptly, not with the startled glance of someone caught off guard, but calmly, as if acknowledging her presence was the most natural thing in the world. "Morning," he said. His voice was low, steady, without unnecessary warmth, but not cold either. Just neutral, balanced. Jessica found herself pausing for a fraction of a second before responding, as though she needed to adjust to the tone. "Morning," she replied, setting her bag down carefully on the empty bed. There was no awkward silence that followed, no forced attempt at conversation. He simply returned to his book, his attention shifting away from her with the same quiet ease with which it had been offered. It was strange, Jessica thought. Most people in a situation like this would feel the need to fill the space with words, introductions, small talk, something to make the shared room feel less uncomfortable. But he didn't, and somehow that absence of effort made the atmosphere feel lighter. She began to unpack her things, slowly placing each item in its place with deliberate care, as if the small, ordinary actions could ground her in a situation that felt anything but ordinary. She was aware of him without looking directly, of the soft sound of pages turning, of the steady rhythm of his breathing, of the quiet presence that didn't demand attention but existed nonetheless. It was not intrusive. If anything, it was reassuring in a way she hadn't expected. After a moment, introductions came simple and without ceremony. His name was Mark Grant. Hers was Jessica Davis. No questions followed, no probing curiosity about why she was there, what she was facing, or how she felt. Just names exchanged and accepted as though that was all that was necessary for now. Jessica sat down on the edge of her bed and leaned back, her gaze drifting toward the ceiling. A thin crack ran across it near the window, branching slightly like a small river finding its path. She focused on it, tracing its shape with her eyes, letting her thoughts settle into something quieter. Tomorrow morning, she reminded herself. Tomorrow, everything would change. The fear was still there, present and undeniable, sitting somewhere deep beneath her ribs. It rose, occasionally pressing against her chest, making it difficult to breathe evenly. But here, in this room, it felt different. Not gone, not diminished entirely, but somehow less overwhelming. As if sharing the space with another person, even a stranger, had shifted something she couldn't fully explain. The light outside began to fade early, as it always did in November. The courtyard darkened, the bare branches casting faint shadows against the window. Jessica lay back on the bed, her body still but her mind restless. She wasn't sure how much time had passed when she realized that the room had settled into a deeper kind of silence, not empty but full of unspoken awareness of two separate lives temporarily intersecting in a place neither of them had chosen. At some point she noticed that Mark had stopped reading. The book rested loosely in his hands, his gaze directed not at the pages but somewhere beyond them, perhaps out the window, perhaps nowhere in particular. There was something in his expression that caught her attention, not sadness exactly, not worry in the obvious sense, but a kind of quiet contemplation that felt familiar. It occurred to her then that he might not be sleeping that night either. Hours passed slowly. The occasional sound of footsteps in the hallway, the distant hum of hospital activity, the faint shifting of light from passing cars, all of it blended into a soft, continuous backdrop. Jessica closed her eyes, but sleep didn't come. Her thoughts circled the same fears, the same questions, the same uncertain future waiting just beyond the next morning. Scared, his voice came softly from across the room. It wasn't intrusive, wasn't abrupt, just a simple word spoken into the darkness, carrying no expectation. Jessica hesitated, then answered honestly. Yes. There was a brief silence, not uncomfortable, just present. Then he spoke again. I was too, he said, a few years ago. He didn't elaborate. He didn't explain what had happened, what he had faced, or how he had come through it. He simply stated it as if the details were less important than the acknowledgement itself. Jessica turned her head slightly, though she couldn't see him clearly in the dim light. Did it pass? She asked quietly. It passed, he replied. Nothing more. And yet those two words settled somewhere inside her, shifting something she hadn't been able to move on her own. He hadn't said everything would be okay. He hadn't offered reassurance wrapped in empty certainty. He had simply shared a truth, his truth, and left it there without decoration. Jessica closed her eyes again. The fear was still there, but it had changed shape. It no longer felt sharp and overwhelming. Instead, it had softened slightly, as though it had been divided, shared in a way that made it easier to carry. It was a strange realization. She was lying in a hospital room beside a man she had known for only a few hours, someone who had said barely more than a handful of sentences to her, and yet in that quiet, unspoken exchange, she felt less alone than she had in years. The thought lingered for a moment, then drifted away, carried off by the slow, steady rhythm of the night. Mark did not try to change anything about her situation, and perhaps that was precisely why his presence began to matter. He didn't offer comfort in the way people usually do, with rehearsed phrases or hollow reassurances. He didn't tell her that everything would be fine, didn't insist that she stay positive, didn't ask questions that forced her to relive what she was already struggling to carry. Instead, he simply remained quietly, steadily, without drawing attention to himself. And in that stillness, Jessica began to notice something she hadn't felt in a long time: ease. It revealed itself in small moments, almost too subtle to name. The way he placed a glass of water within her reach without saying a word when he noticed her hands trembling slightly. The way he chose to sit in a chair beside her bed instead of too close, respecting a boundary she hadn't even realized she needed. He never hovered, never imposed, never tried to step into a role that wasn't his. His presence did not demand anything from her, not conversation, not gratitude, not emotional response. It simply existed, steady and reliable, like something she could lean on without being asked to acknowledge it. Jessica found herself watching him at times. Not directly, but in the quiet, observational way, one notices something unfamiliar yet comforting. He moved with a kind of deliberate calm, never rushed, never careless. When he read fully without distraction. When he listened without interruption. There was no sense of performance in him, no subtle attempt to be seen as kind or good. He simply was. And that more than anything made it difficult for her to look away. The contrast with Evan emerged not as a sudden realization but as a slow, undeniable comparison that formed on its own. With Evan, every interaction had carried an invisible weight. There had always been something to anticipate his mood, his response, the direction the conversation might take. Even in silence there had been a tension, a quiet awareness that she needed to adjust herself accordingly. With Mark there was none of that. Silence was just silence. It didn't need to be filled. Didn't need to be explained. It existed naturally, comfortably, without pressure. One evening after the surgery, when the lingering effects of anesthesia still clouded her thoughts, and her body felt unfamiliar to her, she woke to find the room dimly lit. Her head ached dully, and for a moment she struggled to orient herself. The hospital ceiling came into focus slowly, the thin crack near the window anchoring her back into reality. She shifted slightly, wincing at the discomfort, and became aware of movement beside her. Mark was there, seated as before. A book resting loosely in his hands, though he wasn't reading. "You're awake," he said quietly. It wasn't a question. It was simply an acknowledgement free of urgency. Jessica nodded faintly, her throat dry. Before she could speak, he reached for the glass of water on the nightstand and held it out to her not too close, allowing her to take it herself. She drank slowly, the simple act grounding her more than anything else had so far. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He nodded once, as if the exchange required no further attention, and leaned back in his chair again. That was all. No follow-up, no attempt to extend the moment into something larger. And yet, as she lay back against the pillow, Jessica felt something shift inside her, a quiet recognition of how rare that kind of interaction had become in her life. To be cared for without being overwhelmed, to be noticed without being questioned, to be supported without being controlled. It was something she had not known she was missing until it appeared in front of her in such a simple, unassuming way. Over the following days, these small gestures accumulated, forming something that could not be easily dismissed. He would bring her tea from the vending machine without asking if she wanted it, leaving it on the nightstand with the same quiet matter-of-factness. He would remind her gently and without insistence to finish her food when she left it untouched, not as a command but as an observation. "You have half left," he would say, and somehow she found herself picking up the spoon again. There was no expectation attached to any of it. He didn't wait for her to thank him, didn't look for acknowledgement, didn't turn these actions into something that required reciprocation. They were simply done as naturally as breathing. And because of that, they felt real. Jessica began to understand gradually that what she had once accepted as normal in her marriage had been something else entirely. With Evan, care had often come with conditions spoken or unspoken. Even the smallest gestures had carried an undercurrent of expectation, a subtle reminder of imbalance. Conversations had felt like negotiations, attention, something that had to be earned or justified. Here with Mark, none of that existed. There was no need to prove anything. No need to adjust herself to receive what was freely given. It unsettled her at first, not because it was unwelcome, but because it challenged something she had come to accept as inevitable. She had learned over the years to make herself smaller, quieter, less demanding. She had believed that this was what it meant to maintain harmony, to keep a relationship intact. Now faced with a different reality, she wasn't sure how to respond. One afternoon, as sunlight filtered weakly through the hospital window, casting pale reflections on the floor, she found herself speaking without fully intending to. "You're very decent," she said the word, feeling insufficient, even as she said it. Mark glanced up from his book, considering her for a moment. "I try," he replied simply. Jessica studied him, searching for something beneath the surface, irony, self-satisfaction, anything that might complicate the simplicity of his answer. But there was nothing. Just the same calm presence, unchanged. She looked away, her gaze drifting back toward the window. Outside, the world continued as it always did, cars passing, people moving, life unfolding without pause. And yet inside that small hospital room, something had shifted in a way she couldn't ignore. For the first time in a long while, she felt seen. Not in a dramatic or overwhelming way, but in the quiet, steady recognition of her existence as it was. Not as something to be shaped or adjusted, but as something to be accepted. And that, she realized, was what genuine care looked like. The operating room was colder than Jessica had imagined, not just in temperature but in atmosphere, as though everything inside it had been stripped down to function alone. The bright overhead lights cast a harsh, unwavering glow, reflecting off metal surfaces and pale walls, leaving no space for shadows, no room for uncertainty. She lay on the narrow table, her body still, her mind strangely quiet in a way she hadn't expected. The fear that had gripped her so tightly in the days before had not disappeared, but it had changed. It was no longer sharp or overwhelming. Instead, it felt distant, like something she could observe rather than something that controlled her. The anesthesiologist leaned over her, gently placing the mask over her face, his voice calm and practiced. "Breathe slowly," he said. "You can count if you want." Jessica closed her eyes. She didn't count. There was nothing left to calculate. Nothing left to prepare. Her last conscious thought was not of fear, nor of Evan, nor even of the surgery itself, but of the small hospital window and the bare branches outside, holding on to a quiet promise she had made to herself to see them again. The darkness came softly without resistance, like slipping beneath the surface of still water. When she woke, it was not immediate clarity that greeted her, but sensation. A dull, persistent ache spread through her body, deep and unfamiliar, as if something inside her had been rearranged and had not yet settled into place. Her eyelids felt heavy, but when she forced them open, the first thing she saw was the ceiling white plane, marked by that same thin crack near the window. It took her a moment to recognize it, to understand where she was, and then it came not as a thought, but as a realization that filled her entirely. She was alive. The simplicity of it was overwhelming. For a few seconds she did nothing but breathe slow, deliberate breaths, each one grounding her more firmly in the present. The pain was there, yes, but it no longer felt threatening. It was not the pain of fear, but the pain of survival, the kind that confirmed existence rather than questioning it. Her chest rose and fell steady, certain. She inhaled, exhaled, and in that rhythm something inside her began to shift. The nurse appeared soon after, moving with quiet efficiency, adjusting the IV, checking her pulse, her voice soft but clear. "The surgery went well," she said. "Everything is fine." Jessica listened, absorbing the words not as information but as confirmation of what she already felt in her body. Fine. The word seemed almost too small to contain what it meant. Fine meant she had crossed something she hadn't been sure she could. Fine meant she had been given something back that she hadn't fully realized she might lose. As the hours passed, the haze of anesthesia slowly lifted, and with it her thoughts began to return. But they did not return in the same way. There was a clarity now, a sharpness that had not been there before. The message from Evan was still there, unchanged, as real as it had been the night before. The years behind her had not disappeared. And yet they felt different. Distant somehow. As though the person who had lived through them was not entirely the same person lying in that hospital bed now. She turned her head, slightly aware of the room around her, of the quiet presence that had become familiar. Life, she realized, had not paused for her. It had simply continued carrying her forward, whether she was ready or not. But now, for the first time in a long while, she felt something else alongside that movement. Choice. It was a small feeling, almost fragile but undeniable. The surgery had not just removed something from her body. It had stripped away something else, something invisible but heavy. The waiting, the hesitation, the quiet acceptance of a life that had slowly narrowed around her. Lying there, still weak, still recovering, she understood with a clarity that surprised her she had been given another beginning. Not a dramatic one, not a sudden transformation, but something quieter. A shift in direction. A moment where the past no longer dictated what came next. She closed her eyes again, not out of exhaustion this time, but out of a quiet sense of stillness. The world outside the window would still be there when she opened them again. The same town, the same streets, the same life waiting. But she would not be stepping back into it as the same person. Because she had crossed something. And on the other side of it, she was no longer just surviving. The first sign that Evan was not finished with her came quietly, almost predictably, as if it were simply the next step in a pattern Jessica had only recently begun to understand. It was not emotional this time, not personal in the way his message before the surgery had been. Instead, it was calculated, structured. A phone call, brief and controlled, in which his voice carried none of the hesitation or distance she might have expected after everything that had happened. He spoke as though they were discussing a minor administrative matter, something routine, something that required cooperation rather than confrontation. He told her about documents, about legal procedures, about a voluntary waiver of her share in the condo they had owned together. The tone was almost reasonable, almost persuasive, as if he expected her to agree simply because that was what she had always done. Jessica listened without interrupting, her fingers wrapped loosely around the phone as she stood by the window. Outside, the world was quiet, the winter light flat and unremarkable, but inside something had already shifted. The woman who might have hesitated, who might have agreed to avoid conflict, was no longer there in the same way. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, steady, and unfamiliar even to herself. "No," she said. There was a pause on the other end of the line, brief but telling. It was not just surprise, it was adjustment, the sound of someone recalculating. Evan had not expected resistance. Or perhaps he had, but not this kind, simple, direct, without explanation. "Jessica," he began again, his tone tightening slightly, "don't make this difficult." But the difficulty, she realized, had never come from her. As the conversation unfolded, the underlying intention became clearer. It was not just about the condo, not just about dividing assets or settling accounts. It was about control, about ensuring that she remained in a position where her voice could be dismissed, where her decisions could be questioned, where her stability, emotional and mental, could be turned against her. He spoke of lawyers of proof of her condition after the surgery. He suggested almost casually that she had not been fully capable of making sound decisions, that her actions during that time could be interpreted differently in a legal context. Jessica felt the words settle around her, cold and precise. It was not anger that rose in her, but clarity. He was not just trying to take something from her, he was trying to redefine her reality, to rewrite the narrative in a way that would benefit him. When the call ended, she stood still for a moment, the silence returning to the room. But it was no longer the same silence. It was sharper, more defined, filled with a sense of awareness she had not allowed herself before. Mark noticed it immediately when he arrived later that day. He didn't ask right away. He set down the groceries he had brought, moved through the kitchen with the same quiet efficiency Jessica had come to recognize, and only when he was seated across from her did he speak. "What happened?" She told him everything, not dramatically, not with the emotional weight that might have accompanied the story days earlier, but with a steady, measured tone. As she spoke, she realized something. She was not reliving the pain. She was describing it, observing it from a distance that allowed her to see it more clearly. Mark listened without interruption, his expression unchanged, but there was a tension in his posture that hadn't been there before. When she finished, he was silent for a moment, as though organizing his thoughts. "He's not just asking for the condo," he said finally. "He's building a position." Jessica looked at him, waiting. "If he can prove that you weren't fully capable of making decisions after the surgery, it affects everything," he continued. "Not just property, your credibility, your ability to defend yourself. It creates doubt where there shouldn't be any." The logic was simple, but its implications were not. Jessica felt the weight of it settle in her mind, but instead of overwhelming her, it sharpened her focus. "So, what do I do?" she asked. "You get a lawyer," Mark replied. The answer was immediate, certain, without hesitation, and yet it carried no pressure. He didn't tell her what she had to do. He simply stated what was necessary. The idea felt unfamiliar at first, not because it was unreasonable, but because it represented a shift in how she approached her own life. For years, she had avoided confrontation, avoided escalation, choosing instead to adapt, to compromise, to wait. Now, for the first time, she was being asked to stand firmly in her own position. "I can't let you pay for it," she said after a moment, the old instinct rising reflexively. Mark met her gaze calmly. "I didn't say I would," he replied. "I said you need one." There was no argument in his voice, no attempt to convince her, just a quiet insistence on reality. That more than anything made the decision clear. The following days unfolded with a new kind of intensity. Meetings were arranged, documents gathered, conversations held with a level of precision Jessica had never experienced before. The lawyer, Lawrence Bell, spoke in terms that were direct and unembellished, laying out the situation with clarity that left little room for doubt. Evan's strategy, as it turned out, was not uncommon. It relied on creating uncertainty, on introducing questions about her mental state that could complicate legal proceedings and shift advantage in his favor. But unlike before, Jessica was no longer passive in the face of it. She provided records, 8 years of payments, carefully documented, every contribution accounted for. She listened, asked questions, and made decisions. Each step, each document, each conversation reinforced something that had only recently begun to take shape within her, a sense of ownership over her own life. Mark remained present throughout it all, but in the same way he always had, without intrusion. He did not speak for her, did not take control of the situation, did not position himself as the one who would fix everything. Instead, he stood beside her, offering support where it was needed, stepping back where it wasn't. His presence was steady, not overwhelming, a constant that allowed her to focus without feeling alone. And for the first time, Jessica understood what it meant to face something difficult, not by avoiding it, but by stepping directly into it. The conflict with Evan was no longer just about the past. It was about defining what came next. And as the legal process moved forward, as each piece of his strategy was examined and challenged, one thing became increasingly clear. She was no longer the person he thought he could control. And that changed everything. What grew between Jessica and Mark did not arrive with intensity or urgency, and that was precisely what made it real. There were no grand declarations, no sudden shifts that demanded immediate definition. Instead, their connection unfolded quietly, almost imperceptibly at first, shaped by small, consistent moments that accumulated over time. It began in the spaces between words, in shared silence, in the rhythm of daily routines, in the absence of pressure. Mark never asked her to explain herself before she was ready, never pushed her to move faster than she could. And Jessica, who had spent years adjusting to someone else's pace, found herself for the first time moving at her own. In the early days after she left the hospital, his presence remained steady but unobtrusive. He came by in the mornings with coffee, sometimes groceries, sometimes nothing more than the quiet assurance that he would be there. He did not stay out of obligation, nor did he linger in a way that suggested expectation. He simply existed alongside her, allowing the connection between them to form, without forcing it into a shape too quickly. Jessica noticed this most in the way he listened. When she spoke about her students, about the small details of her classroom that had once felt insignificant to others, he paid attention, not politely, not distractedly, but fully. He asked questions when something interested him, not to fill silence but to understand. And in that simple act, she felt something unfamiliar. She felt valued. Trust for Jessica did not come easily. It had been worn down over years of quiet neglect, shaped by a relationship in which her voice had slowly faded into the background. At first, she found herself holding back, measuring her words, waiting for the moment when attention would shift away from her as it always had before. But that moment never came. Mark did not interrupt, did not redirect, did not dismiss. He gave her space not only to speak but to exist fully within that space. And gradually, almost without noticing it, she began to fill it. Their conversations deepened, but not in a way that felt heavy or forced. He spoke about his past in fragments, never all at once, never in a way that sought sympathy. She learned about his life not through confession but through honesty, direct, unembellished, and offered only when it felt necessary. There was something in that restraint that Jessica understood instinctively. He did not share to be understood. He shared because it was true, and in return, she found herself responding in the same way. There were moments when she questioned it, when the simplicity of what was forming between them felt almost too easy, too different from what she had known before. She had been used to relationships that required effort in a very specific way, effort to maintain balance, to avoid conflict, to hold things together. This was different. The effort here was quieter, less visible. It existed in attention, in consistency, in the willingness to remain present without needing to control the outcome. One evening, as they sat across from each other in the soft light of the kitchen, Jessica realized how much had already changed. She had begun to anticipate his presence, not with anxiety but with a kind of calm expectation. When he arrived, something inside her settled. When he left, the space he occupied remained not empty but defined. It frightened her slightly, not because she doubted him, but because she was aware of how much she had begun to rely on something she had not consciously chosen. "I don't know what this is," she admitted, once her voice quiet but steady. Mark looked at her, not surprised by the uncertainty. "I do," he said simply. She waited, expecting elaboration, but he did not offer it immediately. Instead, he allowed the silence to hold the weight of his certainty before continuing. "It's something worth not rushing," he added. There was no urgency in his words, no attempt to label or secure what they had, just patience. And that patience, more than anything, reassured her. Jessica realized then that trust was not built through promises or declarations but through consistency over time. It was in the way he showed up when he said he would, in the way he respected her boundaries without needing them explained, in the way he allowed her to make decisions for herself even when he disagreed. There was no need to prove himself through grand gestures because everything he did, no matter how small, aligned with what he said. For the first time, she felt no need to question intentions, no need to look for hidden meanings behind simple actions. What she saw was what existed, and that clarity created something she had not experienced in years, a sense of safety that did not come from control but from trust. Their relationship did not replace what she had lost. It revealed what had been missing all along. It showed her that connection did not have to be complicated to be meaningful, that care did not have to be loud to be real. And slowly, as the days passed and their lives began to intertwine in quiet, natural ways, Jessica understood that what they were building was not based on urgency or need, but on something far more enduring: mutual respect. It was present in every interaction, in every decision, in every moment they chose to remain honest with each other, even when it would have been easier not to. And in that respect, something stronger than attraction or circumstance began to take root. Something that could last. The courtroom was smaller than Jessica had imagined, almost ordinary in a way that felt strangely appropriate for something that carried so much weight. There were no dramatic gestures, no raised voices, no moments that resembled the kind of conflict she had once feared. Instead, everything unfolded with a quiet, methodical precision that mirrored the process she had gone through to get there. Papers were presented, statements were made, facts were laid out one by one, each detail forming a structure that could no longer be ignored or manipulated. Jessica sat still as she listened, her hands resting calmly in her lap, aware of the steady presence beside her, but focused entirely on what was being said. Evan sat across the room, no longer the confident figure who had once filled every space with certainty. There was something diminished in him now, something less defined, as though the narrative he had constructed was slowly unraveling in front of him. His arguments, once carefully structured, now seemed fragmented when placed against the clarity of documented truth. The years of shared life that he had attempted to reduce to a legal advantage were instead presented in their full reality: records, payments, timelines, all of it, speaking more clearly than any explanation ever could. When the judge finally spoke, her voice was calm and measured, carrying no emotion beyond the authority of decision. The ruling was direct. The property remained with Jessica. The contributions were acknowledged precisely as they had occurred, not as they had been reframed or distorted. There was no ambiguity left, no space for reinterpretation. It was finished. Jessica did not react immediately. She did not feel the surge of triumph she might once have expected, nor the sharp release of tension that comes with victory. Instead, what settled over her was something quieter, deeper, a sense of completion. Not satisfaction, not even relief in the usual sense, but the simple recognition that something had ended exactly where it needed to. As they stepped out into the hallway, the air felt different, lighter somehow, though nothing around her had changed. Evan remained behind for a moment, standing near the window, his posture uncertain, as if he had not yet caught up with the reality of what had just happened. Jessica paused briefly, not out of obligation but out of acknowledgement. 8 years of her life stood in that space between them, not erased but no longer holding any power over what came next. "Goodbye, Evan," she said quietly. There was no anger in her voice, just finality. He looked at her, but whatever response he might have had seemed to dissolve before it could take form. And in that moment, Jessica understood something clearly: the past does not always end with confrontation or closure that feels complete. Sometimes it ends simply because you step out of it. She turned and walked away. Mark was waiting a few steps down the hall, not watching the exchange, not intruding on something that was hers to finish. When she reached him, he didn't ask what she was feeling, didn't search her face for an answer. He simply met her gaze, steady and present as he always had been. "It's done," she said. He nodded once, understanding not just the words but everything behind them. As they walked out of the courthouse together, Jessica felt the weight she had carried for so long shift in a way that was both subtle and absolute. The legal battle had ended, but more importantly, something within her had settled into place. The uncertainty, the waiting, the quiet compromises she had made for years, they no longer defined her. What remained was clarity. The life she had built before was no longer something she needed to fix or return to. It was something she had moved through, something that had shaped her but no longer held her in place. The future ahead was still uncertain, still unwritten, but for the first time it felt entirely her own. And that, more than anything, was the victory. Their wedding did not feel like the beginning of something dramatic, and perhaps that was exactly why it felt right. It was quiet, simple, almost understated, held in a small office with high windows that let in pale winter light, the kind that softened everything it touched. There were no elaborate decorations, no large gathering of guests, no attempt to turn the moment into something grand. Jessica wore a light-colored dress, modest and unpretentious, while Mark stood beside her in a dark suit that reflected his usual preference for simplicity over display. When the official pronounced them husband and wife, the words did not echo with spectacle, but they settled gently, as if confirming something that had already been true long before it was spoken aloud. They exchanged rings without ceremony, smooth and unadorned, chosen not for their symbolism but for their honesty. When Mark looked at her, there was no urgency in his expression, no overwhelming emotion that demanded acknowledgement. Instead, there was something quieter, certainty. "Thank you for trusting me," he said, his voice steady, as if those words held more meaning than any vow could. Jessica met his gaze and smiled faintly. "Thank you for waiting," she replied. It was enough. Life after that did not transform overnight. There was no sudden shift, no clear dividing line between what had been and what was now. Their mornings remained the same, coffee shared in silence, small routines that had already begun to form long before their marriage was made official. The difference was subtle but undeniable. The space they shared no longer felt temporary, no longer carried the quiet awareness of something still undecided. It had become theirs fully and naturally, without needing to be defined. Mark returned to his work with renewed focus, his days filling again with calls, meetings, and decisions that extended far beyond the quiet boundaries of their home. Jessica, in turn, found her way back to her classroom, to the familiar energy of her students, to the place where she felt most like herself. In the evenings, they returned to each other, not out of obligation but by choice. There was no need to explain their days in detail, no pressure to fill every moment with conversation. They simply existed side by side, each aware of the other in a way that felt both effortless and essential. When Jessica discovered she was pregnant, the moment did not unfold with immediate joy. It came first with silence, with disbelief, with a quiet, almost fragile realization of what it meant. She had waited for this possibility for years, had once believed it might never happen. Now that it had, the feeling was overwhelming in a way she had not anticipated, not because she doubted it but because it mattered so deeply. When she showed Mark the test, he did not react quickly. He looked at it, then at her, as if making sure that what he was seeing was real. Then he sat down beside her, his movements slower than usual, his composure momentarily unsteady. "Is it real?" he asked quietly. She nodded, and in that moment something shifted in him in a way she had never seen before. He pulled her into an embrace, not careful, not measured, but full, as though he were holding on to something he had once lost and could not risk losing again. "I'm scared," she admitted softly against his shoulder. "I am too," he said, his voice just as honest. "But it's a good kind of fear." And it was. Their daughter arrived in the early days of autumn, when the air still carried the warmth of late summer and the light stretched longer into the evening. The moment she was born did not feel like a single event, but a series of sensations that blurred together: pain, exhaustion, the steady presence of Mark beside her, and then suddenly a cry. Clear, strong, undeniable. Jessica barely had time to process it before the small, fragile weight of a new life was placed into Mark's hands. He held their daughter carefully, almost cautiously, as though the act itself required a kind of reverence he had not yet learned. But when he looked at her, all uncertainty disappeared. Jessica watched from where she lay, seeing something in his expression that went beyond joy, beyond relief. It was something deeper, something that carried the weight of everything he had lived through before this moment and everything that now lay ahead. A quiet, overwhelming recognition. "Hello," he said softly to the child in his arms. "We've been waiting for you." In the months that followed, their life expanded in ways neither of them had planned yet. Both of them accepted without hesitation. The house they eventually moved into was not perfect, an older place with creaking floors and a garden that needed more care than they could immediately give. But it was alive. There were mornings filled with the soft sounds of their daughter waking afternoons, shaped by small routines, evenings that settled into a calm they had both once believed was impossible. Jessica often found herself pausing in these moments, not out of disbelief but out of quiet awareness. A year before, she had been on her way to surgery, uncertain if she would wake up carrying the weight of a life that no longer felt like her own. Now she stood in a garden where apple trees bloomed in soft white clusters, listening to the sound of her daughter's laughter and feeling Mark's arms wrap around her from behind, without a word. "I don't want this to end," she said once, her voice barely above a whisper. Mark was silent for a moment before answering. "Then we'll work to keep it," he said simply. It wasn't a promise. It wasn't something meant to guarantee permanence. But it was real. And for Jessica that mattered more than anything else. Because she had learned that life does not remain steady on its own. It changes, it shifts, it breaks and rebuilds in ways that cannot always be predicted. But within that uncertainty there are moments quiet, unremarkable on the surface that carry more meaning than anything dramatic ever could. And this, she realized, was one of them.